What does it really take for a family to rise from struggle to build wealth that lasts a century? Not a lottery win, not a miracle, not even the perfect job, just habits. Habits passed quietly from one generation to the next. Habits built in kitchens, whispered during bedtime stories, reinforced over dinner tables and through tough love. Habits that shape not only how money is handled, but how legacy is imagined. Today, I want to tell you a story. A story about a Jewish family that started with 3 coins in a coat pocket and built a fortune that stretched across 4 generations. It's not fiction. It's not fantasy. It's a roadmap, one that any family can follow. 7 habits, 100 years, and a legacy that outlived every paycheck, every crisis, every challenge. Let's start in 1924. The story begins with David and Miriam, 2 Jewish immigrants who arrived in New York Harbor in 1924 with little more than hope and a battered suitcase. They spoke little English. They had no formal education. What they did have was a relentless work ethic, a deep sense of responsibility, and the quiet wisdom passed down through generations long before them. David worked 12-hour shifts in a garment factory. Miriam took in laundry from wealthier neighborhoods. They lived in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment above a deli in Brooklyn. Every dollar mattered. Every choice was survival. But even in those difficult early years, they followed 2 rules without fail. The first was this: no matter how little they earned, they would always save something and always give something. Even when money was tight, David put 10 cents of every dollar into a savings jar. Miriam gave 5 cents to the local synagogue or to someone in need. "If we can't give when we have little," she used to say, "we'll never give when we have more." That mindset of generosity and delayed gratification was their foundation. The second rule was simple but powerful: never spend money to impress people. They wore worn shoes, mended clothes, and cooked at home. While others borrowed to appear successful, David and Miriam lived far below their means, not because they were cheap, but because they had a different goal. They weren't chasing appearances. They were building roots. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But those small, quiet decisions became the soil that wealth would one day grow from. They didn't know it at the time, but they were already planting the mindset of a future dynasty. By the 1952nd, David and Miriam had 2 children, Samuel and Ruth. Life was still modest. The family had moved into a slightly bigger apartment, but the furniture was secondhand, and every appliance was bought, used, or repaired. Yet from the moment Samuel and Ruth could read, their parents made one thing abundantly clear: education would be their way forward. David didn't push his children to take over the family's small tailoring work. Instead, he told them to study like their lives depended on it, because in many ways, they did. The dinner table wasn't filled with complaints or gossip. It was where books were opened, vocabulary was practiced, and stories of Jewish scholars, rabbis, and inventors were told like bedtime legends. Miriam often said, "The greatest inheritance we'll ever leave you is how you think." And so, the second generation was raised not to chase money, but to pursue knowledge that could create value. While many families around them focused on getting their children into the workforce as quickly as possible, David and Miriam played the long game. Samuel went on to study engineering. Ruth became a school teacher. Neither started rich, but both entered careers that offered stability, growth, and dignity. But education, in their home, wasn't just about school. It was about learning how to manage life, especially money. Samuel was taught how to open a savings account at age 12. Ruth learned how to budget by keeping track of the grocery spending with her mother. They didn't just watch their parents count dollars, they watched them make decisions with intention. By the time they left home, they didn't just know how to earn a living, they knew how to build one. And slowly, the sacrifices of the first generation began to bear fruit, not in luxury, but in the form of children who would never have to start from zero again. By the 1982nd, Samuel and Ruth were raising children of their own, David and Miriam's grandchildren. But this new generation was growing up in a different world. They didn't share the same hunger of their immigrant grandparents. They didn't sleep 4 to a room or ration milk during wartime. Yet something had survived the decades: the mindset. Samuel, now a successful engineer, didn't spoil his children, but he didn't hide the truth about how wealth worked either. He told them early, "Our family doesn't live on luck. We live on systems." That sentence stuck. Ruth, ever the teacher, used allowance as a tool. She showed her sons and daughters how to divide every dollar, some to give, some to save, some to grow. She brought them to community events, introduced them to neighbors, rabbis, mentors. "Your network is your insurance policy," she'd say. "Build it before you need it." And so, by the time the third generation entered adulthood, they weren't just good students or good savers. They were builders. One started a small tech firm. Another launched a real estate company. A cousin went into law and soon began offering free legal guidance to other entrepreneurs in the family. They didn't just earn more, they multiplied what they earned because they had learned how to build income streams that didn't rely solely on their time. Rental properties, dividend-paying stocks, small business equity. They weren't chasing fast money, they were constructing frameworks that paid out over time. And most importantly, they supported each other. When one cousin opened a cafe, the others helped fund it. When one faced a financial challenge, they didn't go to a bank, they went to the family trust fund, established by Samuel and Ruth with quiet discipline years earlier. It was no longer just about survival. Now, it was about scalability. No one was rich overnight. But by working together, by thinking in systems not salaries, they built a foundation so solid that even economic downturns couldn't shake it. The third generation wasn't starting from scratch. They were building on top of wisdom. By the early 2002, the fourth generation had arrived. Children who had never known scarcity, who grew up in homes with libraries, warm meals, and family vacations. To the outside world, they looked like any upper-middle-class kids in America. But inside the home, something very different was happening. This generation wasn't raised to feel entitled. They were raised to feel responsible. Samuel, now a quiet elder with a soft voice and sharp memory, would gather the family every Sunday evening, not just for food, but for philosophy. They didn't call it a wealth meeting, but that's what it was. They talked openly about money, family goals, new business ideas, charitable projects. The youngest kids would sit at the table, sometimes bored, sometimes lost, but always absorbing. Ruth had passed a few years earlier, but her journals lived on. Inside were handwritten pages of lessons, quotes, and financial reflections. The family had turned them into a bound book, the Rothman Principles, a kind of internal family Bible for values and money alike. And at the heart of it all was one clear message. This wealth is not just yours to spend. It's yours to understand, to protect, and to extend. They didn't measure success by income. They measured it by whether the next generation could explain where it came from and where it was going. The fourth generation was encouraged to learn not just in school, but in life. They were taught about trusts, about compound interest, about ethical investing. At 16, they weren't getting cars. They were getting custodial Roth IRAs. When they earned their first paycheck, they weren't asked what they'd buy. They were asked what portion they'd keep and what they'd pass on. It wasn't pressure. It was preparation. Because by now, the family understood. Wealth without wisdom vanishes. But wealth combined with generational thinking, that becomes unstoppable. And so, while their peers talked about careers and cars, this family was talking about impact, education, structure, and vision. They weren't trying to raise rich kids. They were raising future stewards of a legacy. 100 years. 4 generations. From a sewing needle in a Brooklyn basement to a family foundation funding scholarships and launching businesses. And yet, when you ask them what mattered most, they won't say the real estate, or the stock portfolio, or the vacation homes, or even the education. They'll say, it was the habits, the small, ordinary choices, the quiet decisions made in kitchens at dinner tables, during walks to synagogue, or bedtime stories repeated over decades. Save a little, give a little. Live below your means. Invest early, think long. Teach your kids before the world does. Support your people. Talk about money without shame. And build things that outlive you. Those weren't rules, they were rhythms, passed from hand to hand like heirlooms. And together, they created a family that didn't just escape poverty, they rewrote what wealth even means. Not flashy, not loud, but rooted, resilient, and built to last. So now I'll ask you, what habits are you planting today that your great-grandchildren will one day call normal? Because legacy doesn't begin with wealth. It begins with a decision, a conversation, a habit repeated until it becomes culture. You don't need millions to start. You don't need perfection. You just need the courage to break the cycle and the vision to build something better. Drop a comment and tell me. If your family had one rule about money that must be passed on, what would it be? Like this video if you believe wealth isn't about showing off, it's about showing up generation after generation. And don't forget to subscribe. This series is just beginning. Together, we're not just talking about money. We're building mindsets that last a lifetime, and maybe even longer.